welcome to the Open Era Podcast. My name is Devang and Simon. I'm joined, as always, in person by Simon Bushel. Bush, we've done 200 plus episodes of this podcast, and I'm pretty sure this is the first time we've done a recording in person in Toronto because you've graced us with your presence. How weird is this? How do you feel? How does it feel looking at me as I'm talking?
Disgraceful, really.
It's weird. It's weird.
It's genuinely one of the strangest things I think I've experienced in a long time. Trying to think. So when was the last time we actually would have recorded in person together?
When I was still in Vancouver, must have been, right?
Yeah.
That must have been a Sport Chronicle episode, probably.
So obviously pre-pandemic.
Yeah. 2017, 2018, 2018.
2018. So it's literally been
5 years.
5 years in the making to get to this point.
It's a good time to do it, though. You're in town, obviously, and we have a lot of tennis to talk about. But where do we begin? Where do we start with the catch-up, even though we just released an episode last week talking about the Canadian Open and my exploits and travails over there?
Well, let's start there then. I really enjoyed your interviews and the opportunity to chat with some actual tennis people. I thought that was a nice
yeah.
At least one of those people was a full-time coach.
Yeah.
Maybe two.
Two?
Possibly two.
Two to three.
Yeah. How was it covering the event? How was it like? What was it like being on site overall? And what are your key takeaways from the week?
Good question. It was great. It was a blast. It's one of those things that I always wanted to do growing up, and like having that ability to broadcast from a tennis tournament felt a bit surreal. And it was funny, like being, I've had a media pass before to sporting events and to tennis events. Yeah, la ti da, sipping a tea glass with my pinky out as I say that. But yeah, no, it was different because I felt like I was a bit more embedded in the ground or in the scene than I had been before. And it allotted me some privileges, including walking around the grounds when no one was there and just getting to absorb the tournament. But I've said this before, but the first 3 days of many tournaments are the best. And this experience, the first 3 days were really, really hard to top, just with so much action going on. Kind of peters out as you get towards the end. But I think the biggest takeaway for me is that we're thinking about the stars or what happens after the big three, et cetera, et cetera. I didn't see as many Rafa hats, didn't see as many RF hats. I saw a lot of people, heard a lot of people talking about Carlos Alcaraz, which I think generally is a healthy sign.
On a scale of 1 to 10, quite how wet was the week?
5, but not, I mean, Toronto got much luckier than Montreal. And the first few days in Toronto were bad, but it was okay. And I think we didn't get the scheduling monstrosities in Toronto that we got in Montreal through no fault of the organizers. But I think we'll get on to what the tours can do to maybe ease these pains, because quite a few players were quite unhappy about this, and reasonably so. We got some questions about this as well when I put out a mailbag request to our wonderful listeners, so we'll touch on that. But I don't think building a roof for these venues is the most cost-effective thing you can do. Then again, it's raining all the time in August, so I don't really know what the solution is.
Tents? Seems fine.
Some sort of. This is basically a traveling carnival, isn't it? They show up in random cities from week to week, plying their trade, bringing their gear. What's to add a carnival tent to this?
Man alive, can you imagine the opportunity here to work with Cirque du Soleil? How good would that be?
Barnum and Bailey, I believe that's what Andrea Gaudenzi calls himself, Barnum and Bailey, right? That's the PT. Okay, well, not to sue our bridge with the ATP completely, but I did find another key takeaway. Very interesting how tennis works in the media realm when it comes to asking for requests and requesting players to speak, and the idea that you got to put a request in no matter what. So like Andy Murray wins a match, he's still alive, he sets up a match against Jannik Sinner, but you still got to apply to speak to him through the PR people, which I found interesting, because the idea of traveling from city to city, you're not always going to have journalists who are maybe tennis experts. And I think there's little things like that are missed.
You think there's an element of this then that you need to know the inside of the club to really get access then? You need to know how the sausage is made, the inside
a little bit. And you can tell who's been around before, who's been to a few events to know what the lay of the land is. And I think It's not unique to tennis. I think you would find that on any sort of beat if you're covering any sort of sport, but I do think it is a bit more insular maybe than the other ones because it is a bit more niche.
You run into any players when you're in the grounds?
I ran into a few. Nicholas Jari, lovely large man. I think the other thing I realized is that all of these people are giants. Like I'm a relatively tall person, but Nicholas Mahou made me feel like a small person.
I think the thing as well is that I am always stunned by how skinny they are as well.
Man,
that they are obviously ripped and shredded, but like they are tall dudes, tall men and women, but they are like thin, like very petite in terms of their stature. You just have to be like with the quantity of miles that you put in during the course of the year and like what is expected from your body from a flexibility standpoint. You can't be a big Hulk out there.
No.
It's just not possible.
And like watching someone like Alex de Minaur for like the whole week, I've never seen someone have sweat on their shirt within seconds of them doing anything. And it just remains in a constant state the whole time. But it's extremely impressive to watch how he kind of counteracts these behemoths on the tour and with his game, which is basically built on speed, defend. I watched him against Gabriel Diallo, that young Canadian, and it's like the size of his match is massive. Maybe even the heaviness of the strokes matchup it's not lending ADM any favors, and yet he finds a way. And I think that's one of the coolest parts of watching something like that up close is the styles and the variations. But I saw Carlos Alcaraz up close, and I was so tempted to snap a photo on my phone, which I think is against the rules for media people because he was in a backstage area. So it's just like, hi, that was it.
Charlie, my boy.
Good stuff over in England, man.
Yeah,
great job.
Yeah, thank you for doing the deed for us.
The Lord's work.
Exactly. One of the things that I always find interesting as well about watching live tennis or being there in person is weight of shot and just. You can tell literally within about 5 minutes of watching a match of who is dominating the matchup in terms from stylistic standpoint, or at least from a weight of shot perspective. Because even at challenger level or going to watch at that, ranking of the event of the sport, you end up with a situation where you can tell one player is effectively pushing. Like it's always like the person on the other end of the net is like, I'm in charge of every single rally and I can probably dictate how I want to. And then it's just a stylistic choice of whether or not they can respond to it. It's always, I find it really, really interesting to watch someone just be like, yeah, this guy's not going to hit past me. It's fine. So I can just stand in closer or change my style when I'm there.
And I mean, that ADM Diallo match was a great example of that, where I felt like de Minaur was pushing a bit in the beginning and maybe just trying to survive in the early stages, which makes sense against someone who's probably he hasn't been in this situation before after beating Dan Evans and having quite a few more people watching him on court. You have to imagine mentally that kind of changes how he approaches things, and ADM has to just stay in it. Like I was sitting right behind his coach for a while, and like you could imagine, it's a Canadian playing in a Canadian tournament, quite a few people cheering for him. De Minaur's cheering section is literally just his coach. His coach offers nothing really. He's just ADM will say something to him and he'll nod his head or he'll gruffly reply with a short, terse no or yes. And I'm like, I guess like that's what you need. What do you tell someone you're with all the time? What changes when they're on the court? Like I can't imagine it's much, right? Like unless you feel like they need a jolt.
Well, I thought you dive into a little bit of that with Marks himself, right? Of the fact that him basically saying there's no time during the course of a season to make changes. There's no real opportunity to do something. So you're basically trying to give people the tools to make those corrections themselves. And you hope that they are disciplined enough that when you give them the advice, they start to take it on board throughout a course of a season, as opposed to someone going away and working on a jump shot during the course of an off season. Right. You just don't have that in tennis.
Yeah, and they're all so good that like the margins are insanely small.
Which makes like the top of the sport so fucking ridiculous when you have people that are dominating it and you realize everyone's incredible. Like literally so good that to have someone dominate like that is ridiculous.
And it makes me bang my head into the wall about things like the clutch factor, but God, I think it might exist sometimes.
I don't think there's any doubt about it, right? I think it's that one of those, everyone's an incredible athlete. Everyone has the shots. Everyone's technically superb. It really is down to those margins and playing the big points really well. And this is the thing that I always go back to, which is like, what is that separating factor? Like if everyone's an incredible athlete, how incredible an athlete do you need to be to have separation in that space? You have to be just superhuman levels. How good does your forehand have to be a standout on tour? If someone's hitting 110 mile an hour forehand and you hitting 112, and is that enough to really separate yourself? Sometimes it is when the margins are that small.
I was listening to Gael Monfils talk about, I think his most recent win in Cincinnati. We're recording this before he plays Novak Djokovic, but he was talking about like all these, they're all doing generally the same thing, but the bad days and when you really don't want to do it, that's the difference between him and us. And he said it as nicely as he could, but it was also like, we're better than you. The idea is like, you know what? We're not the same. We are not built the same.
I wonder how true that is across the wider sporting world.
It probably gets more pronounced, to be honest. But the other thing is that tennis, a lot of people play it. A lot of people play. I don't think people go to their pickup hoops game and think that they're going to be the next Steph Curry. But I think there's quite a few people who play tennis at a pretty good level that think, maybe I could steal a point or two, which is equally insane when you think about it. So.
They can't. Just for spoilers warning, they are not able to do so. And I've been around enough clubs and enough at that level to realize there's quite a lot of, let's say, 70-year-old white men who I can still do it. I reckon I can still take a game. Sure, dude, whatever you say.
Your boy, Yannick Sinner, won that tournament in Toronto. I'm curious how you felt about it. You got a bit, not lucky, but I would say the Murray walkover and he had a withdrawal, like it lined up well, but these are the tournaments you need to win if you're someone in his position who hasn't won a Masters yet.
Remember we were talking last year about Felix Auger-Aliassime just needing a tournament to go in off his arse, to use the British terminology. Sometimes you just need to have the draw break correctly for you to get over the hump for your first Masters 1000. Lost in all the shuffle on this, he goes up to world number 6. It's his highest ranking ever. And considering how we've been talking about him over the last 2 years, you would have thought he would have been knocking on the door of the top 5, and he never has. This is the highest he's ever been. It's good. It's a good situation for him to get this tournament and get this first 1,000 title off his back, because I think it probably was weighing on him. And I think to take that next step, sometimes you do have to get a little bit lucky.
I watched the Sinner-Berrettini match on a grandstand, and I was like, this could be interesting, because Matteo Berrettini, obviously we know where he's been and we know his accolades, his track record, but also coming back from injury. Bit of a nervy matchup. And also Berrettini, maybe it's the Hugo Boss connection, but widely liked. And I would say that Yannick Sinner maybe was not the fan favorite. It was close to being mixed, but I would say
the red hair. Do you think it's
people are jerks? I think people are jerks, and there's still an anti-ginger bias. But no, I think it was like Matteo's super hot, and like in general, people like him because he seems like a likable guy. But
2023, and we're still going back to this again.
I know it feels bad.
Go back. To
I don't want to tell you what was happening during that Zverev Davidovich Fokina match because it was sad how much support Alexander Zverev had for that match, and he got smoked, which was wonderful. But that match I thought was a huge harbinger for him, and even though he did get the Murray walkover and he got a surprising Gael Monfils in the quarterfinals, he still has to find a way to win that match. And I think the hardest thing to do is to win something you're supposed to. And it felt like from the quarterfinals on, especially when Carlos Alcaraz was dispatched by Tommy Paul, he was supposed to win this tournament, and he did.
And he did. And I think that's actually a ringing endorsement of how his season has gone. I think that ranking doesn't lie. Like, he has been that good, and I suspect we're going to see more noise from him as well. The US Open is a good opportunity for him. It really is. And
I think you could say we've seen the best tennis he's produced there.
Absolutely. Yeah, without a shadow of a doubt. I think he goes into that tournament, considering how the rest of this hardcourt's win. Other spoilers, by the way, he has already lost in Cincinnati. I guess fairly unsurprisingly, to get that emotional, I guess, trough after.
And then at this point, I was talking to someone about this today. It's like, how do you rank these tournaments, or like what dedication level are the players putting into it? Are they kind of limiting themselves, waiting to peak for the US Open? It's almost a fool's errand. Like, I don't know what the perfect lead up is for this. Like, I don't think Novak Djokovic is not trying to win Cincinnati.
I don't know. Is he?
We'll see.
Does he care?
We'll see. But I think the post title hangover is real, and he played a really, really tricky opponent in Dusan Lajovic. But I feel better about Yannick Sinner's chances against one of those two guys, Alcaraz or Djokovic, than I did probably in the summer.
I wonder whether or not, as someone who watched the final against someone like Alex de Minaur, does the speed hold true with Jannik Sinner, watching him live, as much of a clean ball striker as he is talked about? And it comes through on TV. And I think there was some stats floating around I saw in tennis Twitter, amongst other places, of just the sheer difference in terms of speed of ball striking between Alex de Minaur and Jannik Sinner. I think it was something to do with above 120 miles an hour. Jannik Sinner was over 50, I want to say, ball strikes during this course of the week, and de Minaur was at 2. So just that alone is enough to tell you how different they are in terms of clean ball striking and pace and weight of shot.
I saw Iga and Beatrice Haddad-Maia last year in Toronto as a fan up in the stands, and those shots sounded like gunfire because they were electric and automatic. Jannik Sinner's shot his forehand sounds almost like one of those cannons you shoot into the sea as a commemoration or a sign of war, but it's messed up. Like I think his forehand is like a top 5 shot in the game right now. I think that might be a stretch, but I felt like watching it over the course of a week. It's a weapon that his opponents are completely cognizant of and fearful of, and it changes how they play him.
He's just so loose. I think that's the thing that I always find incredible about watching him on TV, is just he never has any tension at any point. He looks like he's a bell sprout out there. Like he looks like he's wobbling in the breeze. The
other thing I saw a lot of is one of his coaching team members, Darren Cahill, was there and sitting like before he got to the center court situation. Cahill's sitting like in a chair basically by the court, and all these people are behind him watching. Didn't stop him from being as involved as he was, and I thought that was fascinating because I think the celebration when he won the title and the fact that he went over to his camp, half of whom weren't there because they were at home or whatever. He's developing a pretty strong bond with Cahill, I think, and that will be. I mean, we've talked about coaches in this game ad nauseum on this podcast, but I feel like he's someone we universally think is a good person to have in your camp, and it showed.
Well, people should probably not go back and listen to some of the slander I've said about Darren Cahill on this podcast at some point. It's
Montreal, Bush, Jess Pegula winning in a bit of a weird circumstance. I think we had Cotton Eye Joe Gate, which we'll talk about. We had Elena Rybakina not happy with the organization of the tour. We had Ludmila Samsonova have to play far too much tennis by the end, and it was clear in the final. But do you take anything away from A, Pegula winning, or B, the fact that I thought Goff-Pegula was the best match of the tournament?
Let me ask you a question as he quickly goes to his notes. Hey, I'm not in my home studio anymore, people.
He's doing it live.
I am doing it live. Let me ask you a question, Dev, because I know you don't have it in front of you. Can you give me the top 5 on the women's side match wins and losses for the year? Who do you think is number 1? Most wins in the season.
Is it JPEG?
It is not.
Sabalenka?
Riveting radio, people. Riveting podcasting. Number 1 is Iga Swiatek, 50-8, which I think is actually the very same record that Carlos Alcaraz has, which is interesting to know. Number 2 is Anya Sabalenka, 41-9.
Okay.
Number 3, Jess Pegula, 42-13. And everyone thought she was having a terrible season.
And I mean, she's been dealing with a hell of a lot of stuff off the court as well. It seems her mother, Kim, is getting better, though. I saw she was in attendance to release the day at the Buffalo Bills training camp, which was cool to see. But had to get a Bills reference in there.
Of course, yeah.
Go
Absolutely.
Bills, circle the wagons. We say it all the time, but I think this week also hammered it home for me. Like, the margins are small. The big 3 in the WTA clearly deserve to be considered the favorites for most tournaments, but the next cut of players, there's not a huge gap between tier 1, tier 2.
Certainly not. I think there are many things to say about what just happened in Montreal, and taking nothing away from Jess Pegula winning this title, because I think it was a great week for her and a good return to form. Admittedly, I just said that she had a 42-13 match win for the season, but big titles she's found it hard to come by. This was a farce.
It wasn't great. It wasn't great.
This was a complete and utter farce from almost start to finish. What is the equivalence in other sports of the idea that you would have to play at a high level at the latter stages of a tournament twice within the space of 2 hours of each other? I can't think of anything else or any other sport. Sometimes they do it in golf, the idea that you would have to play a third and fourth round, that you would combine them together. But realistically, as we say on this podcast often, it's golf.
There's a smattering of random Olympic sports too. I'm like, maybe this happens. Maybe this happens in equestrian when it gets rained out. I don't know, but
probably right.
And that's the horse's deal, not so much the rider. Yeah, and I think what's interesting to me is like Rybakina and the people who are upset with the scheduling, and I think Victoria Azarenka came out very strongly. And since there's a lot of rain in Cincinnati as we speak right now, and God knows how they're going to figure that out because it's a joint event. But I don't know what the solution is here. I am seeing that the night matches issue and limiting it to one night match, but I think we're in that kind of area where it's like we can't sell a separate ticket for one match, so how will we do this commercially? And that is the biggest concern they have.
Sort out your fucking sport before anything else, before you start selling it to people. That's my advice to them. I don't know. Should we hit pause on this one and come back?
Yeah, we'll come back to it. We'll come back. Well, we need a break too. When we come back after the break, we'll talk about Cincinnati. We'll also talk about some news. Plus, we'll get to some fantastic listener questions after the break on Open Era. Welcome back to the Open Air Podcast. Bush, some more final thoughts on Montreal. I know the Iga Pegula match made headlines for hilarious reasons, but anything else that you took away?
I thought the comments that were made by both Rybakina and Swiatek coming out of this were pretty interesting, to be as pointed in regards to the scheduling and everything. And I think it's a shame as well coming out of this, and I think some pretty good tennis overall, and to see the match results that we had during the course of the week. The thing that we end up talking about again is the absurdity of scheduling and the absurdity of the sport, where it's always the women that are on the receiving end of this. It does feel like a bit of a shame to go in that direction, but ultimately, I'm glad to see both of those women speak about this, because far be it from us, a humble podcast, to say this ain't good enough. It really is not.
I mean, the Rybakina Kasatkina match that ended at 4 a.m. in the morning or whatever, like in one way, you're like, maybe that is awesome. And like, that's something that people who were there will never forget, as they probably torpedoed their work week and maybe got fired for staying that long. They're like, well, maybe I don't have to go into work tomorrow.
In for the penny.
Who cares? Who cares? But we had a question from Sakib saying, on friend of the show, Sakib, Tennis with an Accent, great podcast. What can tennis do to fix late night, early morning finishes? As Rybakina recently said, it will impact her for weeks as the routine is completely impacted. It's a tough fix, especially with the next event starting the following Monday. Your views? The calendar is too jammed, and I wonder when they do move to these longer 1,000 tournaments or premier level tournaments, will that help? It probably will. It will help, but I think it'll probably come at the cost of some of the smaller tournaments that we've come to know and love. But if that will help the players, it's hard to argue against it. That being said, the whole reason I think this ecosystem exists is for those tournaments to be able to allow players lower ranked to improve themselves and get better and get their ranking up. So we're losing that by maybe trying to get better with this.
It's kind of like onion layers, I find, on this one, because at the top level, you're just saying, this is a scheduling issue, right? Ultimately, the weather's come. It's just unfortunate that this has happened. But the more you dig into it more deeply, you're like, this might actually just be a structural tennis issue that, like, fundamentally asking these tournaments to try and fit in this many matches in such a short space of time, it's never going to resolve itself. And then you sort of even a layer underneath of that saying, okay, well, why are you having this many thousand tournaments? And is this actually good for the growth of the sport and for the lower ranked players as well to make a living? I think obviously like one of the biggest fixes here is to extend the time period, which they already have done. It's going from 10 days to 2 weeks, which I think is a really good move overall, and will, I think, help reduce the wear and tear on the players' bodies and also get in more matches and be useful for the fans across the board. But Dev, they play too many tournaments.
Well, yeah, that's the thing. And I don't have a good answer for this because I do think there are the longevity of the sport or the people who need these lower level tournaments to survive. I don't know if they're being considered when we talk about these things, but I guess that's just how it is. And maybe the PTPA has a solution for this.
I think salary the players. I really do. I think I know it's been floated as an idea, and your idea of having tennis with a universal basic income or something equivalent to it is, I think it's the right way to go about doing this. If you're a working professional and you're ranked inside the top 300, effectively having your Q school or you're having your tour card effectively guaranteeing you a certain amount of income to play the sport as a professional, it's the right move to do it. And I think it would help substantially across the course of the year.
I saw Stacey Allister, the CEO of the USTA, talking about the US Open and talking about how they probably will not change the night session plans because tennis is a unique sport that doesn't have start and end times. But I think the crescendo about this will only increase as we get into a slam and when the stakes are increased. And as we've seen at the other majors, I mean, where they put the men and women as well is going to be fascinating.
Live statement coming out of the USTA, you got to help us, man. We tried nothing and we're all out of ideas.
Should we talk about some of the Cincinnati stuff, including whether or not this tournament will be there next year?
Is the tournament going to be next year? Is it going to be in Charlotte? Well, I don't think it's going to be in Charlotte next year, but it certainly sounds like there's some pretty big things coming down the line of whether or not this continues to be in Cincinnati. Of course, as we spoke about last year during this tournament,
that's right.
Oldest one in all of tennis.
Yeah.
I think it's oldest. I think it is, right? It's 1870 odd. It's been going a very long time anyway, to the point where this tournament should have much more prestige than it actually does. And I think, what is this tournament? In the same way that we ask about Miami, what the hell is the Miami Open? I think we kind of had that here as well. That North American hardcourt swing, I think, makes sense on paper, but in reality, this definitely becomes an afterthought very, very quickly.
Yeah, Charlotte wants to build a $400 million tennis facility as well, apparently, which,
Charlotte a hotbed of tennis, Dev?
I mean, they produced a few, and their collegiate ranks are quite strong with the tennis players they produce. I don't know, man. Like, I feel like these tournaments, the Canadian Open included, the National Bank Open included, and then the Western and Southern Open right after it, they're in a really weird spot where the lead-up tournaments to the other slams, the ones to Wimbledon, Queen's Club, I think has some prestige. And then the French Open, you've got a bunch of 1000 series ones that it's up to you to consider how important they are. For us here, I wonder if we're teetering on the edge of losing the importance of what these tournaments mean, because we were just talking about players pacing themselves and not wanting to get too rary and ragged before the US Open. But these are, they should be important standalone events, but I think that this fight seems to be coming down to some municipal politics as well as fat cash being splashed or presented to other people, because I think the people in Cincinnati will argue that they are arguably the home of tennis, and their event speaks for itself in the sense that, like, it's a cool place to go and everyone who goes there has great things to say about it. So I hope it doesn't move, but I obviously am used to things being a lot more opaque in the tennis world than they should be.
At what point does the Cincinnati Open end up in Saudi Arabia?
They wouldn't take an American event though, would they? Maybe.
They might do.
Maybe.
You see Javier Tebas during the course of the
week? I
did.
I saw the La Liga president walked it back, and I saw also there's some whispers about applications to be in the Champions League in 2024-25, which will be hilarious. We're not far away at all. But yeah, the calendar, I think, is one of the more underrated horror issues with tennis. Like, we don't talk about how badly we have set this up for the long term, because that's the way it's been done, and that's because the stakeholders have okayed this.
I just don't know how you're supposed to have a normal, grounded life with solid friends and relationships around you when you're on the road 48 of the weeks of the year, probably around that, I would say. You're probably getting close to that by the end of it in terms of how much travel is expected of you. It just can't be easy mentally on you. And that doesn't get spoken of enough when thinking about the resiliency that it takes to be a top level tennis player.
I mean, all the Australians have basically left home and picked up sticks for the whole year outside of a month. And Ash Barty talked about that as well. And I feel like that's not a unique to Australia thing.
And then we ask questions of why she wants to retire at the age of 25.
Yeah. I don't pretend to know the solution here, but I do feel like we are at a point where either it'll be like that, like you're alluding to, Bush, where like the highest bidder will win and we'll kind of just relocate to the slams and then maybe these signature events, and we'll lose that aura of the 250 and Kitzbühel.
Mm-hmm.
Or we keep things as they are and we see more and more players maybe decide to hang it up earlier, praying that the legends or the superstars find enough purpose to stick around.
I think we're actually approaching that sort of end game of the neoliberalism of sport in general. We're seeing a much accelerated pace of that, to think, the Premier League is the apex of it. You can never get any more than this. Well, what about Saudi Arabia? What's the next version of that? I'm not actually sure there is a whole lot of next version of that, short of maybe Amazon buying, not even that, right? Like they don't even have the cash to front up to do that sort of thing, to have that level of ownership over it. Or what's the alternative? Like I've not seen a league move in a direction where they're trying something uniquely new and an opposite way of generating revenue, and perhaps thinking about it more from a degrowth perspective of making sure that you're just running a sustainable product where everyone is happy and they're just making a few things at the edges. It doesn't seem like that's the direction any of these sporting leagues or institutions want to go in.
A common refrain I heard over the last week being at the event was like, that's just the way they've done it. And I feel like that should be warning bells for everyone, because I think eventually we're going to run into a point where that's just not good enough and we have to adapt and change. But these are scary conversations to have,
Yeah.
So.
Well, there's so much money at stake, right? Especially, it's a lot easier to just do nothing, or just by doing nothing, I mean literally doing the exact same thing you've done before, because there's continuity in it and the safety in it. But safety also gets you UConn being set on fire.
Yeah.
So take that with a grain of salt, perhaps.
Before we get into the questions we got, which we got a bunch of really great ones. Cincinnati so far, obviously this will be dated by the time you listen to it, but I mean, a bunch of people have lost. All of the seeds basically have lost. Do you need to see, and also this is just an incredible quarterfinalist. We have Max Purcell, one of the breakout stars of Toronto. Phenomenal slice and an amazing serve. Double star, but
he's a big boy as well, isn't he?
Killing it on singles, back-to-back weeks. But we got Alexei Popyrin, Adrian Manarino, and Max Purcell in a 1,000 level quarterfinal. This is incredible stuff.
You might be able to add Tommy Paul to that if you can make the comeback.
If you can. But in a larger sense, how much are you watching Novak this week to see?
I think he'll win this tournament. I don't think there's any. Who knows, right?
I have every time when it comes to Novak, I do now think about the long game and what he really cares about. Because I think he's fully mastered the idea of losing finally in situations where it literally does not matter.
Was the quote floating around during the course of the week, wasn't there? He was asked how long he thought about it after he lost the final at Wimbledon. He said about an hour, is what his response was.
What a life.
That's also a lie, by the way. That's an absolute lie.
The fact that he said that, it's a lie. That's a warning sign. That's a lie. That's a lie.
Was his PR manager standing next to him when he said that? Remember when we were joking, or maybe I was making this joke and you were nodding along quietly, but as I was saying it, implying that now that he's got the world number one record and the slam titles and everything, how many more tournaments is he going to start phoning in?
Right.
I know it's somewhat tongue in cheek because his level is astonishingly high even when he is phoning it in. Are we going to start seeing him phoning it in? I mean, this tournament is a really good indication of whether or not that's going to happen, simply because he should win this tournament.
Yeah.
Given the speed of the court and given how good he is on a hard court and everything else, and also his record, he should win this tournament.
I love Josh mentioned this on Discord. I do love how god awful he is at doubles. Like whenever things are going bad and you're like, man, How is everyone so perfect? Look at Novak Djokovic play doubles. It's not a great sign, but I don't think he will. Phone it in is it's a relative term, but I do think he has an FU America tour planned. I do think it matters to him that he's kind of like, hey guys, I'm still here. I still got loads of fans in New York. It's going to be a big deal. I think it's setting up for a pretty theatrical couple weeks in New York, but I do want to see how Novak kind of handles this week, because maybe one of the more illuminating aspects of the Toronto tournament was like, no, Novak's not there, and a lot of the conversation had moved over to Carlos Alcaraz as like, this is the guy, he's got 2 slams, we're ready, this is happening, let's get into this craze. Novak Djokovic has done nothing to make us think that he's still not the best player in the world.
I would disagree personally.
You don't think the 2 slams prior to Wimbledon don't factor in on what this season has meant? Like, do you think Alcaraz winning that final has pushed him ahead, really? Because I don't think that's true.
I would say that is the case, but I was on record saying that before, right? Like, I have to continue to keep digging, exactly. Hold myself accountable on this one. I think he's a better player than him. I think he's the world number 1 for a reason. I think his record and his also performances against Novak Djokovic, that calamitous French Open aside, I think is a demonstration. I think he's a better player. I really do. I genuinely think he's surpassed him. I would take him at any court in the world other than in Australia.
You take him on Ash at night?
I would. Yeah, I think.
Wow.
I do. I think he's better than him. I think we touched on this before, but I think Novak Djokovic is, either the second or third favorite at the US Open, which is kind of crazy to think about.
That is crazy. Let me recover from fainting, as you said, third favorite, because I'm trying to. Is it?
I think it is Medvedev, right?
What have you seen from Daniil Medvedev recently that makes you comfortable saying that?
Yeah, I know, and there's a recency thing in this one as well, but his start of the year and his record at hardcourts in 2023 is
pretty good.
Is remarkable, and he's really, really fucking good on that court.
He's dogged over 5 as well, which I think
he knows how to beat Novak Djokovic as well.
It's fair. I thought I expected a sinner slipping, but no. Okay, Daniil. All right.
Tommy Paul,
TP, new Nalbandian. Okay, let's get to the questions. Got a lot of good ones. Thanks to everyone who sent them in. Owen, friend of the show, Owen Lewis. Should we give up on the idea of the future of tennis / next gen? For all we hype young players and new generations, it seems like what happens is 1 or maybe 2 or 3 freakishly good players come along every so often and blows everyone away.
I think there are patterns in sport. I think that is universally true of who is at the head of the sport at the time, and then a cohort of kids who grow up watching that athlete or like the teams or any of that side of thing, which I think does inspire a particular play style. If we just talk about tennis specifically, I think that actually is a thing. I would go back and check and see if like a group of players who grew up, let's say within a 3 or 4 year period of each other, I think they do have similarities and crossover. Whether or not that means that they are actually good enough to make that step is another matter. And I think that you talk about that lost generation, right? Your Milos and Dimitrov and all those players, to see whether or not there's a pattern of how they played, or whether or not they were trying to do something, and then your big 3, big 4 were just better at them than that. And then what comes after that? What is the next evolution of it within tennis? So I do believe that is true. I don't know whether or not that means that we should give up on this generation narrative, because I do think there are patterns there. I also think it's, Carlos Alcaraz and Iga Swiatek are just better than everyone else.
Yeah.
That is also legitimately true. You can just have freakishly good players.
Yeah, I think I'm with you. I think maybe the powers that be expected that lost generation to start winning, and thus they didn't think they had to do things like the next gen or like building specific tournaments for them. And
just a natural evolution, right?
And then when they saw that wasn't happening, and that the same people were continuing to win, they had to pivot and kind of be like, we need to focus in on this. And I love the idea of the next gen finals, that tournament, just because I think they're trying things that they would never try in a normal tennis setting, because it's not considered real, which maybe is an indictment on this whole process. But not panicky, but I do feel like they realized a bit late that it's not like how can you expect these people to reach those pinnacles of those people? It's not about that. And I think the marketing of it has to change kind of to what Owen's saying.
I think youth is a big thing as well, like to take advantage of it and actually to have a younger audience and go in that direction, especially for the sport of tennis. Like it doesn't do TikTok particularly well. It doesn't do Twitch particularly well. It doesn't do any of these avenues where you actually might expect to see some young players marketed and pushed. For goodness sake, Carlos Alcaraz is 20, right? And you would be forgiven for thinking that he's like fucking 35 from the way that they market him and talking about him, which is crazy to think. And then they have athletes like Ben Shelton, who I think would fall into that category as well. They could probably market him a lot better and target him. But I hope he's going to play at the next gen finals because he's a really good player.
We'll do one more before the break, and then we'll get the questions, the rest of the questions afterwards. But Brian Gerstein sent in a bunch of good ones. But this Felix one, I think, is something we could touch on before. Says, what to do about Felix? He referred to being, quote unquote, back to the drawing board. But what does that mean? Just stay with the same coaching team and start over, or finally take control of his career and hire the best damn coach out there you can find? He has no plan B, never mind C or D.
That's just utter shade thrown to Tony Nadal there.
Right. I mean, where is the lie?
I mean, I thought you touched on this really well in those two interviews last week to ask about what the margins and I thought it was interesting as well. Like both of their responses were effectively like, just do the same thing. Like the margins are so small, just keep going and just keep making small improvements. I don't think you're going to see a lot of technical improvements from him because that's just not possible. I could see something like a big deal for him would be something like a big new mental coach, or like move in a new direction and change the camp in that regard and try just a new outlook from that approach. Because I don't think we're not going to see him start serving volleying more or anything in the near future. That's just not going to happen. Belief is clearly a big thing. And these are things that are difficult to quantify, I think, because without being inside of the camp, you can't get a sense of how much belief has been lost. But you can see the results on the court, and clearly some belief has been lost there.
I think the Frederick Fontang conversation we had, like, I don't think that anyone in his camp thinks this is going to be a eureka moment, quick fix. Bam, he's back. He's back to 2022 Felix. I think the knee stuff during the year, he probably should have stopped playing. Like he probably shouldn't have played through that sunshine swing, and they probably regret that as well. But there's also the idea of ranking points and maintaining your place on tour and pushing yourself through the grind because he's a young guy and you can't really take this time off. And I wonder if they could do that again, they would not have pushed him through this. But this is now, to me, a more, like you said, it sounds like the body's okay, but mentally it's a long road back. Like the scenes in Cincinnati, you beat a Matteo Berrettini that's still Matteo Berrettini. I think that was an important win for him. But I wonder what the conversation is when you lose to Adrian Manarino right after that. Someone who's, don't get me wrong, proven himself again and again and again as a really tricky out. But I think not a lost year, but I feel like what the Felix we see that shows up at Davis Cup is going to be fascinating, because that to me is maybe somewhere where he can recollect himself. He's defending a load of points at the end of this year too.
I thought it was interesting as well, and not to take too much umbrage or take a different opinion than Blair Henley had about the idea that any given tournament you can turn things around, because I think this obviously that's true. You've seen it throughout history, but I'm a big believer in just stringing match wins together. And I think building confidence and just, even if you're losing quarterfinals, at least like win 2 or 3 matches in a week and feel like you can get back to winning ways. Because I think that's the moment that you start seeing tournaments come, like, and start winning again.
Go play some challengers, Felix.
Go play some doubles, man.
Is Serbitron just available at all times? Is that tournament just going that we can go and get the title win at?
Strava. Where else could he go? Transylvania.
All right.
All the good ones.
We'll finish up the mailbag, plus we'll get to parting shots after the break. It's the Open Era Podcast. Coming up in a bit. Welcome back to the Open Era Podcast. The mailbag is fully open. Got some excellent questions from everyone, so thank you so much. I mentioned Brian sent in a few, and I want to kind of combine this with something that Josh sent in on the Discord as well. Where do you think Canadian tennis is at right now? Because we had those interviews with Guillaume Marx and Frederic Fontaine, and we've had pretty decent sample size of watching these people since at least 2019 onwards. Some amazing successes and some blips, some injuries. But I think something I heard a bit more of the last week was like, where are the next group of players coming from? Or is there another crop that can equal the Bianca, Layla, Felix, Dennis crew? And it seems like there's some really interesting collegiate talents, especially, and we mentioned Diallo, but it doesn't feel like it's on the same scale. Where do you think Canadian tennis is at?
Well, the answer is, I guess, somewhat flippant, which is that it's really, really hard to generate talent who are going to be top 10 in the world. I think you have to set your sights a little lower sometimes. With all that being said, there is a reason, and I think there is a consistency in countries like France and Italy and the United States of being able to produce consistently top 100 players over and over and over again. And I think the infrastructure is a huge part about that. One thing for certain on Canadian tennis, it just is not that popular of a sport in Canada.
Well, I mean, and that's something that Josh got to in a two-part question when he asked, how does it differ from other countries in terms of audience? Is it less elitist, even more niche? And I can't get that experience of when we went to the Vancouver Open out of my head when we saw that Challenger event push in Vancouver, where at that event at a literal country club, it felt extremely elitist. And then when you go to the National Bank Open on a Monday and the tickets are the cheapest they are, and you see literally wide swaths of humanity coming to watch tennis of all sorts the whole day, and you're like, wait a minute, this is perfect. So I think the accessibility will remain an issue for a wide amount of people who just don't have tennis courts around them. But I don't think tennis broke out in this country as much as I thought it would after Bianca won that slam. I thought it would have been more prolonged and sustained. And if that's because she didn't keep winning, then that's on us, not her.
I've always thought, and I've always maintained the idea that tennis itself, the sport of tennis, is more people want to play it. It's more accessible to a lot of people than the actual image that I think is presented about it on TV. And I always think that's somewhat sad, is because you do go to Wimbledon and you do go to the National Bank Open, or any of these tournaments that actually have a level of accessibility, or in cities that are, cosmopolitan or have a wide perspective from a social, economic, or race or gender, any of those backgrounds. Everyone goes. Like literally everyone goes. It is a fun thing to go and do. It's a very accessible sport from a spectator perspective because it's really, really straightforward. It is just 4 lines of net and 2 people with a ball. Like it's very, very easy to get behind and very easy to understand. And you do get some really cool and interesting rallies. That being said, like it's just an access thing. It's just really fucking expensive to build infrastructure now. And it's only begun to become worse, I think. We've seen that across the board, the idea that building tennis courts or having tennis courts, that is valuable real estate in the middle of a city center. And in a country like Canada, where, what percentage of people live in cities? It's like 90%, some ridiculously high number. That's tough land to find to go and play tennis. Would you rather, and just even from a developer standpoint, with the direction that Canada goes with its housing market, would you rather have a 90-story high-rise or 4 tennis courts? It's a pretty easy decision to make.
Yeah, I think the amount of players choosing the collegiate path, even if it's for like 1 year or 1 semester, will increase, because I think there's the educational aspect, but also there's the idea of like trying to develop a life outside of the machinery that is pro tennis, which I think can be difficult. Last question. Friend of the show, Karina. Parity in the WTA. Would you rather have a dominating player like an Iga last year, or anyone can win vibes? This, I feel like the WTA for a while was the idea that anyone can win, and we've talked about that. And then I began to hear some murmurs about the idea that Iga always wins. So is this exciting, which made me laugh. But I think we're in a really good spot with the WTA, where there is parity, but there is the expectation that we know people will produce amazing matches if they're slotted against each other.
Yeah, I think there's a nice happy medium on this. There's like dominance with a chasing pack kind of thing.
It's like the Peloton chasing
where you want someone who is like, I mean, comfortably the world number one, but you're always like, or are they?
Or are they? Eyebrow raise.
I think that's the best position you can get in your sport in general. I think that's really where you want to, where you're like comfortably, these people or like this team or this player, you know, they're the best in the world, obviously, but they're still fallible. I think that's ultimately the best position.
That's the mailbag, Bush. Let's get to parting shots.
Oh my Lord, you're going to make me do parting shots. Goodness
You're doing
me.
it. You're doing it live.
So Feliciano Lopez has retired and we completely missed this, Dev.
I acknowledged it personally, silently.
You acknowledged it. What's the current thing that's going around? You fell to your knees in a Walgreens. You fell to your knees in a Shoppers Drug Mart.
I was at an H&M, actually. Yeah.
So Deliciano, we probably shouldn't use that. It's not.
What are you into Judy Murray over here?
Jesus. Let's cut all of this. Any reference to Judy Murray as well. Lopez is retired. One of the stalwarts of the tour, right?
Yeah.
Like you can't think of anyone. As long as I've been watching tennis, he's been there. This is really kind of unfathomable that someone of that stature has gone from the game. Not just a rank and filer, someone who was at the top end of the sport, albeit in doubles. It's crazy to see him gone because we thought the guy was going to play forever.
Davis Cup winner as well. Now fully merged into his tournament director life, which I don't know if once you become a tournament director in the ATP, you immediately become an evil villain, but I think he's done that quite well.
It's the round glasses, isn't it? Man bun and round glasses.
Yeah, Deliciano, I mean, 41, he kept grinding. We had Gael Monfils and Novak Djokovic play on a Thursday night in Cincinnati. The combined age there might be the oldest that we've seen on tour. But I have a lot of respect for Feliciano Lopez, the player. I do have a lot of respect for the idea that he treated doubles like the game it is, which is a class game. But I don't know if I love tournament director Feliciano Lopez.
Yeah, I think we can say fairly comfortably we enjoyed watching the player, and we will move on from this segment
to Andy Murray.
To Andy Murray, yeah. Andy Murray up to 36?
I think that's right.
36 in the world. So the highest he's been in a long, long time. He gave an interview to Money Carrier during the course of the week, just talking about how proud he is of getting back to that ranking. And I think we both have, shall I include you in this? I have certainly said that I never thought he'd get back into the top 50. So shows what I know about tennis. And I couldn't be more happy to be wrong about that as well, because this is a remarkable return to grind it out the way that he has.
I don't know if I said that, but I've definitely been on the record being like, why are you doing this? And this is upsetting for all of us. This is painful. Andy, please stop. So I mean, I was clearly wrong. And I think what I underestimated was how much this sport means to him on a guttural level. Like, I mean, if you watch the documentary, you clearly get that vibe where he's like, put the vibranium in me. I'm willing to do anything. You're like, okay, this seems somewhat unhealthy, but
somewhat unhealthy.
But there's a joy of watching him now without the expectation. Seeing him beat Max Purcell in Toronto, you got that crowd who is just hanging on everything he does. And it's really cool. And I think in an era maybe where not everyone is showing up all the places they should. And I mean, the schedule is insane, and I don't begrudge anyone from taking the time for themselves, but the fact that Andy Murray's showing up everywhere in the world consistently and still grinding away, I mean, how can you not admire that?
I was watching a documentary about Sir Viv Richards, the great West Indies cricketer who famously never batted in a helmet. And the thing that he said was like, it focuses the mind. It makes me watch the ball more. And the very next sentence was, if I die on a cricket pitch, I'll be happy because that's where I'm happiest. I kind of feel that way with Andy Murray, right?
Oh God, it's like a serve. Oh my God. Okay, well, swiftly moving on.
Exactly. Bastian Faken?
He was in Montreal, by the way. I saw some photos, but...
Did you get a pronunciation of his surname?
I did not.
It's too bad. Either way, He had a tweet during the course of the week, or next, what the hell you want to call it, with Jannik Sinner now out of the discussions, who is the best active player on the ATP to never win a Masters 1000, and he gave his short list: Kai Nishikori, Milos Raonic, Casper Ruud, Gael Monfils, Nick Kyrgios, Kevin Anderson, Richard Gasquet, Matteo Berrettini, and Fernando Verdasco. This is a really interesting list. This is an interesting discussion of who would be your choice here, Dev.
I really want to go Milos because I mean...
Are we comfortably saying, by the way, that Kevin Anderson's the best player on this list? I think we have to, right?
The best player?
I think so, right?
Kevin Anderson?
2 Slam finals?
The best, did you say? B-E-S-T?
I think so.
Get the hell. Are you wearing a Fighting Illini shirt under there? Are you a University of Illinois booster? Kevin Anderson?
I am secretly a big fan of the Presbyterian Church. In fact, I think I'd rather pick Richard Gasquet over Kevin Anderson. But that to me is just who I am as a person. Casper Ruud's been winning 3 finals.
I'm putting Milos there, though. I'm putting Milos there because that Andy Murray Wimbledon final was not fixed, but it felt awful watching that because we all knew what was going to happen. We all knew the Queen was watching. Andy Murray was going to win that match. And Milos, I know Kai was in that group of the lost generation, but I do feel like Milos was maybe one of the front men, and for that reason, I pick him.
I wonder, actually, if we go back and look at the stats, I assume Nishikori had probably the best ELO ranking of all of these players, I would guess, just from a consistency standpoint.
So there's another good piece of trivia, and I'm going to ask you this right now quickly. Josh brought it up. Between 2011 Indian Wells and 2017 Madrid, the Big Four won 54 out of 58 Masters 1000 titles. So there's 4 titles they didn't win. Do you know who won?
Is that pre-Kanyas?
2011.
Oh, 2011.
2017, yeah. Post-Kanyas. This is the post-Kanyas era.
This is definitely post-Kanyas.
That was the second name for our show ideas. Post-Kanyas. Open era barely won, but post-Kanyas was that. Yeah.
We need to do a retrospective on Guillermo Kanyas at some point. It's a really good one to do. Wawrinka's never won, right? He's never won it.
Bang, that's one.
Oh, he did win one. Okay.
I will do you a favor and give you another one. Marin Cilic.
Mm-hmm. Well, that makes sense. Did Nishikori win one?
No.
He didn't win one?
Not in that time period.
I feel like there was a serve bot in there as well.
A French serve bot with a wonderful style who beat Roger Federer in Toronto to my shock in 2014.
Nicolas Mahou.
It's Joe Willie Tsonga. I've given you 3.
Yeah.
Cilic, Tsonga, Stan. There's one more, and he never won a slam, but he was always in the conversation. The Bulldog.
Oh, for real?
Yes,
yeah.
You got it.
Okay.
What an insane stat, though, and I mean, that's just, I think that's good. Probably that they won all those titles, but also is it? I'm not sure. I do think the end of tournaments, especially before slams, like the idea that you know who is going to be there was such a huge thing for the viewing public that it was like appointment scheduling that you knew if Federer, Nadal, and Novak were playing at 1000, they'd be in the final and that meant something. I wonder if we've lost some of that. I don't know.
There's something to be said about tuning in and having consistency and knowing who's going to be at the latter stages. But there's both positives and negatives, I suppose.
Shall we get to Ballgate?
Ballgate rears its ugly head again. Remember, this happened it's happened several times during the course of this year as well. But Danny Medvedev was speaking about how challenging it is to play attacking tennis. And we've spoken about this topic before, about it's not necessarily the court speed that's getting slower. It's definitely the tennis balls. He seems to be very on board with this, talking about how challenging it is to play with some of these slower balls. Dev, maybe I'm not so tinfoil hat at this point. Maybe it is. It's all the tennis balls.
Wouldn't it make a lot more sense? Wouldn't that make a lot more sense than the the surfaces are like weirdly
you completely change a tennis court.
Yeah, because they're the same. They're not getting them from a different warehouse where there's like, oh, we went to the wrong guy.
It's like a wrestling ring.
Sorry, guys, we bought plexiglass. Oh, whoops, my bad. But we'll put this in anyways.
That's really funny. The idea that it's like a wrestling ring that someone has to go and put it up before they start every match.
There was a moment in Toronto where they had the wrong netting up. They had like the doubles netting, and they had to go bring over the singles netting from somewhere else. But it makes a lot of sense, and he's not the first person to say it. I loved how he talked about the players that can generate the pace on the ball you need. Didn't expect Davidovich Fokina and Casper Ruud as the two people he brought up, but I mean that's really interesting to see like what a player would think about who can generate that much pace.
Davidovich Fokina strikes a big old tennis ball.
Also, Casper Ruud is very clean, and his execution is nearly perfect. Outside of some other things. Sorry, moving on.
We chatted about it as you approached into the studio today. WTA and AT players were featured in Vanity Fair.
Friend Caitlin Thompson wrote that article.
Caitlin Thompson did write this article. I thought overall this fashion was horrendous.
Okay, that's not where I expected that to go. I mean, so I thought JPEG she looked great. I thought Mackie McDonald looked great. I don't know if he would ever wear this in public. I thought Tommy Paul looked really cool. Again, I just watched The Matrix, the newest one, right before I saw that Tommy Paul photo, so it felt meant to be. I think this is good, but it's also fascinating that there is no surefire star in this group, but they're all worth watching. Is that enough for the American tennis fan who cares about tennis and fashion, which I think there is a crossover?
There's that internet thing about like Zoomer or Boomer, who wore it best, right? The idea that a bunch of Gen Z are wearing Crocs now. I get that sense out of looking at this that it wouldn't be too far removed from the idea that you could see a 70-year-old wearing this.
It's fashion. I wear basically the same things every day, and I don't know what it means to have style and taste. But if someone wants to give me the jacket Tommy Paul wore in that photo shoot, I'd wear it tomorrow. So that's all I'm saying here.
You heard it here, Vanity Fair.
Anna Wintour. Come on, man.
She has associations with tennis. Come on. It's not too difficult to make the jump here. Okay, last two. Before we get 2 challenges remaining. Stefanos Tsitsipas, and I quote, "This lady is imitating a bee right before I serve." What a quote. What a fantastic quote.
Audible, picked up by the chair umpire microphone, which I mean, that's just cinema.
Which noise would you make to annoy Stefanos Tsitsipas if you were sitting behind his serving arm?
I think the dial tone. Like the like when you don't hang up the phone and you just leave it on. I think that would be the one. I watched quite a bit of tennis last week in Toronto. Maybe the worst display, the most upsetting display. Steph mailing it in against Gail Monfils.
Oh, yeah.
That was not, but he did that in Cincinnati as well. And I'm worried now the discourse is going to completely turn on Steposa, or I don't know what the Steposa as the relationship partnership, but the Hubert catch match in Cincinnati was also a bit of a demolition. I don't know what's going on with Steph.
Yeah, I guess we'll find out soon.
Yeah,
in some due order as he wins the US Open in 6 weeks' time, 4 weeks' time, 2 weeks' time, whatever the hell that is. World number 1, Iga Swiatek, we touched on this earlier, to round out parting shots, was interrupted in the semifinal against Danielle Collins.
Yes. No, JPEG. Was that the JPEG? Yeah, it was JPEG.
I thought it was against Collins.
I think it was JPEG. Yeah.
Either way.
Yeah.
She was interrupted by Cotton Eye Joe.
Do you think I'm trying to think how else that could have happened. Like, was that on a playlist?
It's such a specific song.
Yeah.
What happened that this managed to get? Who plugged in the aux cable?
We need to get Tennis and Bagels Andre Rollenberg on the show, who was in Montreal, to give us the inside scoop. But maybe the weirdest thing I've seen, and also heavily affected that tiebreak. Like, there is no glossing over that impacted the match entirely.
I thought they both handled it incredibly well.
Yeah.
To
I
be
think
honest.
someone could have made a huge stink about that. Yeah,
absolutely.
You're right.
Is there a song that you would play to interrupt a tennis final?
I've always thought about this weirdly, but I think I would play Eiffel 65's Blue Dabba Dee Dabba Die.
Interesting that you went in that direction because I went for the British pop band Blue
Oh my God.
with All Rise.
All right. Okay. That's good as well. That's good as well.
Will we get sued if we put that in the show?
Maybe. Dylan, let's find out as we eye our producer ominously in person because we're doing it live in person. I think that's it for parting shots, Bush. I think it is.
2 challenges remaining. What's happened with you? Tennis.
Oh, tennis. A lot of tennis.
Did you eat anything good? Any good food on the ground? What is the catering like?
Fantastic. No,
good?
it's quite good. And I don't know. I got a celebratory New York Fries poutine when I finished my on-air duties, and I felt like $1 million. Not an advertisement to New York Fries, but if they want to sponsor us, please let us know. No, it was a great week. I will say here's one, and it's because you're here, Bush. But public transit. I used to go to this tournament all the time growing up. Before they built the subway extension in Toronto to get up to York University. Back then, it's a bit of a mission to get there. I remember watching Federer Cilic late into the evening in 2014 and having to take 8 buses to get home at a terrible hour. It's much better now. And I just trying to fathom how long it would take them to build those extra stops now, and it'd probably be finished in 2069. But public transit, a great way to go watch live events, a great way to avoid getting stuck in awful traffic, and a great way to get around the city.
Yeah, absolutely. And if we can get new mayor Olivia Chow and
look at this Toronto man. He's in the city for 3 days and he's name checking the mayor.
Why on earth do your streetcars? Why are cars driving on the tracks? Like, what is?
Listen, sir, we got a lot of problems over here. I know. It's all roses, and you're like, whoa, there's people here and tall buildings. But yeah, we got a lot of problems.
My putting shot was going to be the city of Toronto.
I honestly, Dish, what do you got? What do you got, Bush?
So I will say something positive. My actual parting shot is Hadestown because I went to go and see it the other day.
I saw that too.
It's fantastic.
How good was that?
It was really, really good. Were you there the other night?
I was there, a couple weeks ago.
It would have been really funny if we were on the same
That would have been great. Wow, that was, man, how fantastic. Live theater. How impressive are those actors and actresses?
Oh my God, it was incredible. That guy's falsetto.
Right?
Really. And then obviously the big bass notes that you have from good. Hades himself. Why do we build the wall, my children? Go and see Hadestown if you have not seen it.
Seriously. I've loved it. Man, that's hilarious that you saw it too, but it was great.
I've been wanting to see it for a long time. It's been on the top of my list to go and see. So.
I'm revising mine from public transit to musical theater. Musical theater is awesome. And I've been impressed by performers my whole life, but there's a different element to me than doing it live in front of like a lot of people over and over again, but bringing the same energy. It's awesome.
Next week on Open Era, Dev and I...
we're changing. Okay, so we're calling it post-Conyers, and then we're just going into musical theater as the end arc of this show. Okay.
We will review book after book after book. My actual one. People are more friendly in Toronto than in Vancouver. I think it's universally true. I think
that's right, too.
I think it is. And it pains me to say it. Vancouver is not a very friendly city. It's very, very cold, and it doesn't have... Why? I didn't understand this when I was there, Bush, and I still don't. But no, it's totally true. It's totally true. Toronto, they all hate us because they ain't us, and it's because we're just too damn friendly. Yeah, I mean, I think Toronto's got a lot of problems, but there's one thing that I would definitely say. It's you do feel...
No, earnestly, I think that's right.
I think you do feel a bit more warmth when you're here.
Well, we'll end on that extremely
depressing note.
Heartfelt/depressing note. Simon Bushell live in studio in Toronto, Ontario with the gang, looking at Dylan on the ones and twos. What a moment. What a wonderful time on Open Era. A reminder, we are on patreon.com/Open Era. Join us there, get the show ad free. Plus you get it early on Sundays. And best of all, you get access to the Discord where we're chatting tennis all the time, including today. We're asked for some questions, plus everything that is Cincinnati. It's a great time in there. We're also on Twitter, Open Era Pod. I'm trying to tweet from there, but I can barely operate x.com now. So I mean, if you see a tweet on there, understand it took me very long to craft it and post it. So appreciate that. And lastly, a rating or a review wherever you get this podcast. As we try to get this pod into more people's ears, we always appreciate feedback, emails, podcast@openera.ca. Send them all in. Let us know what we got right, what we didn't, and we might respond. I think that's it for producer Dylan on the ones and twos, and for Simon. Thank you so much for listening to Open Era. We'll talk to you next week.